Hi, my name is Cindy Rang with the Fabric Patch in Ephrata, Washington, and we're working through our O Tannenbaum series. This is our class number 8, block number 7 in a 10 block series. And what you might notice is that I'm standing in front of a different quilt. We've been sewing in my sewing studio in front of my version, and this is Brittany's version, and we're now out at the shop. And I just want to show you that she did something fascinating with hers, which is super, super cool. So here's her O Tannenbaum quilt, and she sewed buttons all over it so that this can be her advent calendar. Oops. And here's all of her advent pieces. And I just want to show you that she has this really cool pocket. Here's our little presents at the bottom of the quilt. And we'll be talking about this in class number 10. And I'll show you this little option. It's not included in your pattern, but I'll show you how to do this. And all she did was she just made a little pocket with a little button so that when she's done with Christmas or done with all of the, or grabbing all of the advent pieces out of there, everything is nicely stored with the quilt, and she can even button that closed. But today what we're going to work on is our little 60-degree triangles that are going to make all of the edges. Okay, so the block that we're making today is the 60-degree triangle, basically the edge of our little tree. And again, this is class number 8. So if you're new to this series and you just found us, there are the first 7 classes on our YouTube channel. You can find the pattern, fabrics, lots of other things on our website at fabricpatch.net, and lots of other videos. I think we have over 450 tutorials, classes, sew-alongs on our YouTube channel. So again, this is class number 8. We have this one and 2 more afterwards. Our last class will be putting the whole thing together. This block can be made multiple ways. There are specialty rulers, there are specialty tricks, there are template pieces, all kinds of ways that you can do it. I am choosing to teach you paper piecing because there isn't any other opportunity in this beginner series to teach you paper piecing. And I love paper piecing. I think it's something that everybody should know how to do. And this is a simple one to do because it's just 3 pieces. And more than that, whenever you paper piece anything, it comes out exactly right. And since we want our points and our edges to be exactly right, this is a perfect opportunity for that. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to get up close here in just a few minutes, and I'm going to show you how to do that. But first, let's talk about what we've already done with our series. So we're going to look right here at my kit. So what we've done is all of our other blocks that we've put together as we've been piecing along. We have all of our blocks from block number 1 are in here. All of our blocks from block number 2, 3, 4, all of them are in here. All of my leftover fabric is still in here. And the other thing, you've probably seen this before in some of my other classes, I suggest a desiccant. You don't purchase these anywhere. They come in all of your shoe box and your clothing boxes. And all they are is something that will absorb moisture and odor. So if you have any kind of a project pouch or a plastic bin, something that you're storing your pieces in, plastic bags, anything that's going to keep any humidity, moisture, or odor off of anything, I just throw them in there. I might have either some large ones or small ones. I change them out all the time. So those are in there. All of this together for our final class. But for right now, what I'm going to dig out of here is I'm going to dig out some of my some of my greens and my background color. I'll find that. Okay, so out of my greens, I'm going to need 10 pieces of green, and then I'm going to need 20 pieces of my background. And let me just show you your pattern for a second. Depending upon when you got your download, the way that I had written the pattern shows in the beginning all of the blocks with the little layout and how many blocks of each style we're going to make. And then as we worked through each block was sort of a standalone class where it said, this is how you're going to cut it, this is how you're going to piece it, this is how many you need to make, and then we'll go on to the next one. This is how you're going to cut it, this is how you're going to piece it, this is how many you need to make, we'll go on to the next one. Well, here's a funny thing. This is the page that some of you might have that is original, and it has the page that you're going to photocopy. We'll talk about that in a second. It has the directions on it. What I omitted in some of those early patterns was exactly what to cut. So grab a pencil if that's what you have, and I'm going to tell you what you need. Or if you have one of the newer versions, when I realized that, it should say that what you need are 10 mixed green squares that measure 5.5 by 5.5. So by mixed green, depending upon whether you have primary colors for your tree, traditional colors for your tree, whatever your color is, mix these up a little bit. You'll need 10 squares that are 5.5 by 5.5. The other thing that you're going to need are your background squares. And these are 5.5 by 3.5 inches, and you need 20. So again, if you have an early pattern, that's the information that's missing on there, to cut 20 rectangles, 5.5 by 3.5. And you can see that the quilt that we're making in the series has a dark background. The quilt that I had at my house, I think, has a kind of a creamy color background. And of course, Brittany's has this nice, pretty, bright background. So whatever it is that your background is, 20 of these, 10 of these. The other thing that you're going to need is you're going to need paper patterns. The unique thing about paper piecing is that you're sewing directly onto the paper. Once you're sewing onto that paper, you don't get to use it again. We actually end up ripping it off of the piece. So we need 10 of these. So this sheet right here, you're going to make 5 copies. Don't use your original or your pattern. You won't be able to use your pattern again. So take this page and make 5 photocopies of it, maybe 6, so you have a bonus just in case you have some sort of a mistake, and that'll give you the 10 blocks that you're going to use. I want to mention for 1 second that I tend to use just my regular inexpensive copy paper. When I'm making something really nice, it might be a 24-pound, or something kind of day-to-day, it might be 20-pound. If I can find something that is cheaper than that and thinner than that, that's what I'll use for my paper piecing, because it rips off fairly easily. But there is some really nice paper piecing paper. This is super, super thin. There's also water-soluble paper piecing paper, which I should have brought back here. And I think it's called Tony's, but it's kind of expensive. I think that you get 12 sheets for like $8, maybe $8.99. It is kind of nice because then you just have to spritz it with a little bit of water and it comes right off. But I'm just going to say, absolutely not necessary. If you're doing some fancy paper piecing with a ton of little pieces to it and you're sort of over picking out all of that paper, just know that there is some water soluble stuff that you don't have to worry about, and it'll make your job easier. For this particular project, I just have to say I probably would not waste my money on that. I would just find my cheapest, most inexpensive paper. And again, it's going to be garbage afterwards, so it can be whatever you want it to be in whatever color. All right, I'm going to make some copies. I'm going to cut up my pieces and then set up my sewing machine, and we're going to be right back. Okay, after you've cut your 10 5.5-inch green squares in multiple greens and your 20 5.5 by 3.5-inch background squares, and you have your 10 different patterns copied, we're going to come over this for just a second, but I want to show you just a couple of other notions that I would suggest for paper piecing. One is some sort of a glue stick. There's a couple different things, and I would say that you just want to make sure that your glue stick is appropriate for fabric. So that means it's going to be non-staining, non-yellowing. It's going to disappear, dry, soft, not be gooey. And so it's typically not that 50-cent glue stick that is meant for paper. This one is kind of nice. It seems seems to look the same, but it actually dries nice and soft, dries kind of powdery, and it's permanent until you're done using it. The one that I really like, though, is I do like the Quilter Select Fabric Glue Stick. There's a couple different brands that are like this that have a colored glue, and this is actually the one that I'm going to use. There's another one, I think it's a Bowen brand, and it has a pink glue stick. So you'll see this one in a second. And then the other thing that you're going to need for paper piecing is your add a quarter ruler. They come in 2 different styles. One is an add a quarter plus that has this little flat edge. That's what we're going to use today. Or if you have a basic add a quarter ruler that just has your blunt edge, that's perfectly okay. They're called that because they have an extra little 1/4-inch lip there that we'll get familiar with in just a second. You're also going to need your favorite rotary cutter. Okay, with paper piecing patterns, there's a couple things that you're going to see that's fairly universal. One is that they tend to suggest where your 1/4 inch seam allowance is, and that's actually drawn, and that's what this one is. The other thing is that you are always sewing on the right side of the paper. Our fabric goes on the back side, a little bit strange. Wrong sides together, also a little bit strange. The other thing is that typically you have the numbers of the fabrics that you're putting down. We did not add that. You could go ahead and add it now. The big thing that you want to know is that we're starting in the center. So this would be number 1, this would be number 2, and this would be number 3. And if you're following along with your pattern, I list all of these out and everything that I've already said, which is 5 copies of this. And your steps is that you're going to start with your center triangle. So we cut a piece that's at least 1/2 inch bigger all the way around. This would be true of anything that you're paper piecing. That's how we came up with this 5-inch piece. And so then what we're going to do is we're going to put wrong sides together. We typically either pin it in place or glue it in place. I prefer glue because if you put a pin in here, you're just going to be able to feel it. It'll rock a little bit. We are using a ruler, so that's where my little glue stick comes in. And again, for me, I like this because you can see, or maybe you can't see, I'm not sure if you can see in the camera, but it creates this fluorescent color, so I know exactly where that glue is. So then I can go ahead and put this down, give it a little bit of a press. And then this is glued in place and it's kind of nice. And again, it is permanent in that it's going to stay stuck until I either want to reposition it or if I want to tear that off. But if something happens and I've pulled that off, it's going to dry nice and soft. And if I actually even sew through this glue, what will happen is you won't even be able to feel it. It's not going to gum up my needle and it's not going to create a hard chunky spot there. So that's why I like fabric specific glue sticks. All right, so here's my piece number 1. So that's all that it is. Now I'm going to sew on piece number 2. So to sew piece number 2 onto piece number 1, I'm going to sew right on this line right here. And so the way that we do that is we indicate exactly where that line is and 1/4 inch past. So that's where this little add 1/4 ruler comes in. So the add 1/4 plus, it has this little lip right here. And so what I would do is I'm going to lay this right on that line and I'm going to fold this over on top of that line, take my little add 1/4 ruler. Here's my little 1/4 inch lip. I'm going to lay that right over the top and you probably can't tell, but it just locks right into place right there. Then I'm going to take my rotary cutter and I'm going to cut that. Now, if I had this one, this was the earlier one and it's a blunt edge, all we do is we take some sort of a card, we put a card on that little spot, fold that over onto something kind of hard, and then we still have that same lip and we lock that lip on there. So this is pretty smart. If you have your old one, it still works fantastic, but the new ones have that pretty cool little design on there. All right, so once we've done that, what we have is we now have, I'll turn that so you can see that better. We have 1/4 inch of fabric past the seam allowance that we're going to sew. The next piece is, of course, going to be our background piece, and that is what piece number 2 is. This is the part in paper piecing that people get really confused about because what's happening is you're going to flip this over. We sew right sides together, and then you're going to flip it back and you sew on that line. However, the reason that we picked this one is because you've got this funny little angle. So if this is the way that you're going to sew that on, let's flip this open for a minute and see what happens. What happens is you may or may not have hit all of those edges because of the way that it's flipping out. You might end up with a funny little corner over here. And so sometimes you have to kind of watch that. We sort of feel like we've probably given you enough fabric that if you accidentally did that, or if you just sort of powered through it, you're probably okay. But if you want to make sure that you don't have funny little bits down there, the other thing that you can do is you can do a little bit of pre-cutting. With pre-cutting, what people will sometimes do is they'll make a template out of the paper itself. just cut this little section off, and then they know that they're going to be at least a ½ inch, if not that ½ inch, a ½ inch excess all the way around. But one little trick is that we've already cut off a piece, right? So we've cut this piece off of right here. So if you lay this on top of the piece that we've cut, and I'm going to come all the way over to this edge, because this is the piece. This is what's confusing, is everything is backwards. This is the piece that's going to fit right here. This is the piece that's going to be waist. So I'm going to bring this all the way over so my 60-degree angle is just right. I'm just going to go ahead and lay my add 1/4 ruler down there, just because that happens to be the ruler that I have. I assume my hand's going to be right in front of you. Cut that off. This is my little waist piece. As is this. It was actually just my waist piece that was serving as a template. Because now what will happen is if I take this, I'll scoot that over so you can see it. You can see that that piece, I don't have to worry about the angle. I don't have to worry about anything. I'm just going to go ahead and flip that over. And knowing that I have that 1/4 inch seam allowance, I'm probably going to just nudge it up just a tiny bit. So I have a little hangover here and a little hangover there, so that when I sew my 1/4 inch seam allowance and I open that up, you can see that I have fully covered all of my paper, which is what I want to do. So I'm going to bring that back over. But then what's happening is I'm going to flip it over. I'm going to go to my sewing machine and I'm going to sew this line. Let's talk about our sewing machine for a second. You can use whatever foot you're using. I always like to have a new needle, or at least I will change my needle when I'm done, because when you're sewing through all of that paper, it is going to dull your needle. The other thing that I tend to do is I tend to change my stitch length. On my machine, you can see that my regular stitch length is going to be a 2.5. I want it to be a little bit closer together. Oops. So I want a 2.0. I could even go down as far as a 1.8, or this one goes to a 1.5 if I want to. So what that means is that my stitches are going to be closer together. The reason I want that is because after I'm done sewing this, I'm going to rip that paper off. And I want to make sure that in the act of ripping that paper off, I don't actually tear out my stitches. So that's why we like to adjust that just a little bit. So then I'm going to go under my machine. But what you can do is, since I've already folded that over, you could actually just kind of do one last little check. Just make sure that you have right sides together on your fabric. You have your little edges right where they need to go. And just before I get ready to sew, I'm just going to go ahead and flip that open. And what I'm going to do is sew right on top of that line. One last little tip with paper piecing is that we tend to start sewing 2 to 3 stitches in front of that line, and we sew down to 2 or 3 stitches past. So I've sewn right on that line. And of course, what's happening is that line is telling me exactly where my seam allowance should be. So when I flip it back over and press this open, I have this perfect angle and this perfect block. So I normally, while I'm paper piecing, I have my iron set up, and I'm just going to go ahead and press that open. One thing I like to mention is that the ink from your paper can heat transfer to your ironing board. So if you have a really fancy ironing board and you don't want those funny little lines, just put a little piece of waste fabric down so that that ink transfer doesn't matter. All right, once I've pressed that, I'm just going to finger press this one. It's time for me to do the other side. I have piece number 1 and piece number 2 on. So now I'm going to put on piece number 3. I'm going to do this in exactly the same way. I'm just going to take my add a quarter ruler, and this is my add a quarter plus. So I'm going to lay it right on that line. Fold this over, and I have a little bit of stitching right there. So all that's going to happen is I'm just going to kind of tear my paper so that I can get my paper right where it needs to be. I'm going to crease it, pull this out, take my little lip, turn this so you can see it, and then I'm going to cut that off. Okay, so once you've cut this, again, you could use this as a template. You have a couple different things. The one thing I want to mention is that one of the things that people make the biggest mistakes about is that idea that we are doing everything sort of backwards. So it's generally a really good idea just to reorient yourself to what piece, because if you bring this over and you lay this out here again and cut, notice that I have right sides together. What will happen then if I do that, if I cut that piece, let's say that we did that, ignore the fact that I have an example to show you, but if we lay this here and cut this, look what's going to happen is that when I come over to sew this on, it's the wrong side, right? Because it's been flipped. So just keep in mind that if you're using this as your template, it's going to be right sides up so that I can lay this down and cut right there. Before I do that, I want to show you one other option, one other thing that you can do. And that is just in looking at this, I can lay this on top because again, I've got right sides up. I can see that this is the way that I'm going to do it. I can flip this over and just kind of put a little crease in it just so that I see that this is where I'm going to cut it. I could even, if I don't want to cut it because I don't trust myself, I can just go ahead and flip that over right sides together because I can see, I don't know if you can see my little crease that I just put in there. And then I can go up to my sewing machine, double check everything, and sew right on that line. Let's just go ahead and do this one that way. And again, I'm going to start a couple of stitches in front and sew right on that line and end a couple of stitches past. Okay, so then I can take a little peek at that, and sure enough, you can see that I have enough that's come all the way around. So now all that has to happen is I just have to trim this edge off. And I could actually even do that just with a piece of with a pair of scissors, or I can just flip that over. And now that I know that I'm right, and I don't have to rip anything out and start over, I'll go ahead and trim that off. And here's our block. I'm going to press this open and then we're going to come back and trim it. Okay, so I went ahead and just gave this a quick press, and so you can see that this is my block. And again, I just want to mention, this is a 60-degree triangle block. There are multiple ways to do it. I'm going to say that personally when I do sew, I actually do paper piece this block. This block can be a super tricky one to do. And even though that might have seemed tricky paper piecing it, once I get one down and I recognize all of my little mistakes, then it actually does go together fairly simply for me. If you're having issues, think about the issues that you're having. And if you have like paper showing down here, obviously it's the way that you're positioning it. If you want to start with a bigger piece, instead of 3.5 by 5.5, if you want to have a 7-inch piece, whatever you want, it doesn't matter. I tend to not like a lot of waste, and so that would be the piece that I would use, but you can certainly start with something larger if you'd like to do that. And you'll see that in paper piecing, sometimes they'll talk about using strips, and you cut as you go. All right, so we're going to flip this back over because now what we're going to do is trim it up. And when I trim it up, I do use this outer line. And again, we showed this in the beginning that here is my sewn line and here's my little 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around. So you can go ahead and take your add a quarter ruler and go ahead and lay it there and cut right on the line if you like to. But I kind of like to just double check my work essentially. So I'm going to go ahead and just take my regular ruler. This one happens to be a 6.5 inch ruler. So what I can do is I can lay this down. I'm not sure if you'll be able to see these lines or not, but I'm going to lay this down so that I'm going to cut on this dashed line and this dashed line, but it also helps me to monitor to make sure that I really am ending up with a 4.5 inch block. Another thing that I can do, I often will use a wet erase marker. We do sell these on our website. You can find these just about anywhere. And it's a wet erase marker, not a dry erase, because I can go ahead and just mark my ruler so that I'm remembering exactly the line and what I'm trying to line up. And then as soon as I'm done with that, I can just take a wet finger or a wet paper towel and remove that mark for the next time. So I'm going to go ahead and just indicate that. I'm going to go ahead and lay this down right on that line. And again, this gives me an opportunity just to go ahead and see that I really am at my 4.5 all the way around. I'm going to go ahead and cut. And then I'm going to turn it. Not only line up on my cut line here and here, but also make sure that I have my 4.5 inch block. So I'm monitoring this line that I've previously marked. And that's it. Here is my block. So now all I'm going to do is tear off the paper. So I like to crease it just like you're ripping a check out of a checkbook. And this is why we have our stitches a little bit closer together, because when you're ripping this paper out, you just want to make sure that you're not ripping out those stitches. And up here, this is why we stitch a few stitches in front and a few stitches past, just to make sure that we don't have some funny little hole up here. And you might have some funny little flecks of paper in your seam allowance. It doesn't matter. It's just going to become lint in your quilt. It's not going to matter at all. So if one, oh, see, and there's my little glue. So see that little glue? And see how it'll just kind of lift off, but it was still kind of sticky. But what's happened is this is now dry. It's dry, it's powdery, it's not gooey at all. And I don't know if you can see or not, there is some little bits of paper in my seam allowance. I am not going to pick at that. If I pick at that, I'm going to pick out those stitches. I'm going to leave it there. Totally doesn't matter. No one will ever see it, feel it, or know that it's there. There's my block. Here's my other blocks. These, all I have to do is just rip off the paper. And that's it. So you're just going to go ahead and continue that. This is class number 8 is making 10 of block number 7. So let's see. Next week, we are going to work on fusible web, and that's for our little bows. That's going to be class number 9. And then finally, class number 10 is going to be sewing it all together, which will also be adding our presents at the bottom. So see you next time.
Thank you for watching our video. We invite you to leave a comment, hit the like button, or better yet, subscribe to our channel so you never miss an episode. You can also visit our Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, or Pinterest pages, or find all of those things and our online store at fabricpatch.net.